I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Deb Marquardt from the Department of English, and I teach in the MFA program in Creative Writing and Environment. This is our final event for the Symposium on Wildness, Wilderness, and the Creative Imagination, and I just want to thank all of you for participating and being part of this. I'm going to forego the reading of the sponsors. You can see who they are. We're grateful to all of them. It's right here in the back of this beautiful brochure. And in the interest of time, just move ahead because I want to explain. I know some of you are planning on going to the Larry Shin keynote at 8 o'clock, and we will end up before 8 o'clock, so you'll have time to scoot right over there. So don't worry about that. When I was young, Onyx Smith wrote in her essay, Staying Wild, I experienced my first taste of the wild from our summer house in the dunes bordering Lake Michigan. Running on beaches, gathering wildflowers nestled within the maternal curve of the dunes. Seeking wild places would become a lifelong quest. That lifelong passion for wildness has resulted in a prolific and accomplished career as an author, a filmmaker, an editor, and an environmental activist. Born in Paris, she grew up on the north side of Chicago with her parents who were Hungarian Jewish émigrés seeking refuge in the U.S. from German oppression in Europe. Onyx describes her younger self as a dark-haired, bookish city girl who was smiling but secretly rebellious. Her father, Stephen Deutsch, was a successful commercial and fine arts photographer who surrounded himself with left-wing writer friends like Studs Terkel, Gwendolyn Brooks, and the novelist Nelson Algren. Her parents' reputations as photographers had followed them from Europe, so when they opened the Deutsch Photography Studio at 75 East Wacker Drive in 1938, she writes, celebrities came to be photographed. Sonja Henie, Joe Louis, and a young Lena Horne. She continues, Duke Ellington signed an autograph for Kathy and me, and he kissed us full on our mouths. I had my picture taken at the circus with the Lone Ranger. Jackie Robinson signed a baseball for me at Wrigley Field the year he joined the Dodgers. The photo my father snapped of Jackie and me appeared in ebony. I wore a beret with a green ribbon. My French braids fell almost to my waist. The magic of photography was so potent, it eventually led all three of us sisters into filmmaking. That lifelong interest in the photographic and filmic image has led her to many of her creative projects. For example, A Natural and Human History of the Oklahoma Tallgrass Prairies, complete with photos and creative prose, titled Big Blue Stem, Journey into the Tallgrass, which she wrote for the Nature Conservancy. And more recently, The Wide Open, Prose, Poetry, and Photographs of the Prairie, published last year by University of Nebraska Press. In film, Onyx has worked as the executive producer of several documentaries, including one about the grizzly expert Doug Peacock, and a documentary about the fine Montana poet Richard Hugo. She was the executive producer of the prize-winning film Heartland, starring Rip Torn, and she was a founding member of the Sundance Film Institute. Her interest in a beautiful little novella by a former University of Chicago professor, Norman MacLean, titled A River Runs Through It, led to the eventual production of the film by the same name, on which she and William Kittredge served as co-producers. Her nonfiction books include a collection of place-based travel and environmental essays titled In This We Are Native, on going away and coming back, and a memoir titled Homestead, about making a home with her husband and 4 young sons on a 163-acre ranch in Montana's Blackfoot River Valley. Onyx moved to Missoula in '64 with her husband Dave, who began a job in the English department at the University of Montana, teaching romantic poetry and the Victorian novel. I just want to tell you this one anecdote because it's just too hard to resist. After the existing farmhouse on their 163 acres burned, Smith and her husband found an abandoned log house sitting on a field of sagebrush and wild iris one day while trout fishing 30 miles downriver from their own property. They tracked down the owner, who was absentee, bought the house for $200 with another $100 for the outbuildings, and then they spent all of June that summer living in a tent with their sons, dismantling the house with mallets and crowbars. They stamped each beam with a number corresponding to a diagram that her husband Dave had drawn, and then hauled the entire house in pieces, the 30 miles to their property, and reconstructed the house, as she writes, like a giant's Lincoln log puzzle. In 73, Dave decided to quit his tenured professor's job, and it's perhaps a testament to her infinite patience and sense of goodwill that Anna consented to move from Montana to L.A. with Dave, taking their 15-year-old son, their 6-year-old twin boys with them, and leaving their 17-year-old son back in Montana to tend the ranch. They would spend what would prove to be half of the last year of her husband Dave's life in a one-bedroom apartment in the Amor Arms on Orchid Street, a block from Hollywood Boulevard, while Dave worked away at screenplays and Anik pounded the pavement. Eventually they made the decision to return to Montana. Shortly after their return, Anik's husband died suddenly of a fatal inherited metabolic heart disease that was untreatable at the time. That Anik survived this catastrophic event, going on to raise her 4 sons, going on to finish and improve the reconstructed log home, going on to fight logging companies and gold mining operations through her conservation efforts, is a testament not only to her strength as a person, but to what seems to me to be her inherent sense of what's good and right and important about the world and the way we move through it. Anik Smith has been the luck of my later life, William Kittredge has written about her. He continues, she's someone who's willing to stay humane no matter how disconcerted she might be in her heart or pissed off at the wayward fragility of things. With Kittredge, she co-edited the groundbreaking anthology of Montana literature, The Last Best Place, that literally reimagined and transformed the national perception of the state of Montana. In her environmental activism, she's described herself as a wasp, a gadfly, and a pain in the corporate asses of several companies and individuals making their living on the natural resources of the region. Once, when she was having a conversation with her neighbor about suburban growth and intense logging and the dangers of huge gold and copper mining projects slated upriver, her neighbor declared, "Progress. You can't stop progress." To which Anik replied, "Oh, yes, I can." So happy to introduce her and have her here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Anik Smith.
I think I'm going to blush and say thank you and goodbye. Can't live up to that. That's for sure. Well, thank you so much, Deb, and thank everyone here for having me and Bill. It's been a great pleasure and fun to get to Iowa, back to the Midwest again. Sort of a route, maybe a ganglia of a route. Anyway, I feel very much at home in the Midwest, and I love prairies, and I love this part of the world. I said this morning or this afternoon when we had our panel that I would talk then about prairies and today, this evening, about rivers. And since Deb chose the name of this get-together as the river that runs through it, I thought I would read you parts of an old essay that I wrote about the Blackfoot River and my connection to it called The River That Runs Through It. And I'm going to jump around a little bit. Some of it is outdated because it is old, and I'll try and fill in some of that and try and leave some time so that we can talk. It's called The River That Runs Through It. On summer evenings, I look north from the deck outside my log kitchen and watch night crawl up the Bear Creek drainage from the blue-black valley of the Big Blackfoot. I cannot see the river or the creek from where I sit, but the humped mountains all around are scarred by clear cuts and slashed with logging roads. Owls cry, ghosts of old forests rise in dusky light. I imagine the deep woods as they were before Anaconda, before Champion and Plum Creek. A long-billed snipe dives from the clouds, wind sounding through his feathers in a trilling, whistling mating call. Some nights the northern sky pulses green, green waves and luminous stripes passing over the eaves of my shake roof. After fireworks one 4th of July, in our Wild West days of the 1970s, a bunch of good old boys and gals were passing the Jack Daniels around a fire burned down to coals. A visiting writer, actually it was our friend Jim Crumley, the detective writer. Jim Crumley stood by the tailgate of his pickup, stoned on acid. He looked up to the sky, then at us. You seeing the same thing I am? I cannot fathom what my friend saw in his altered state, but the rest of us were craning our heads toward the light show on the Milky Way. We studied the northern lights with the fascination of Neanderthals gawking outside their caves. Remembering that night, I think of light flowing like a river. I think of blood and sap, the common, recurrent, and fluid patterns of life. I am not a fisher person. I have tried many times to catch fish on a line, sometimes to please others, sometimes to satisfy myself. But I do not like to snap the necks of shiny, wiggling cutthroat trout or rainbows or dolly vardens. You eat them, you can kill them, Dave would scold me. Dave was my husband. Where I live, you learn that respective tracking and killing of wild game is more honest than buying domestic meat, better for the world, perhaps better for the soul. Killing, however, is never a matter of logic. My squeamishness regarding fish goes back to my Chicago childhood. My fat little Grandma Deutsch would take me to the Jewish fishmonger's shop on Broadway for smoked Lake Michigan whitefish in wax paper, smelly, greasy, but delicious when sautéed in butter. And after thunderstorms at our summer house in the Michigan dunes, scores of alewives would float onto the beach and die, their stink so rotten we held our noses. Still, I attach myself to men who love to fish, and it has been my good fortune to live along trout streams. Now I'm going to skip a little part. In western Montana, all highways run along pine-forested river routes carved through mountains by ice and running water. The Big Blackfoot empties into the Clark Fork of the Columbia River a few miles east of Missoula. Our place sits on a meadow a mile and a half above the Blackfoot, but the river's presence ripples in my imagination as if it murmured outside my door. The Big Blackfoot has become my metaphor for change and connection. It seems I have been standing in the same place for a quarter of a century, watching the chaos of my life flow by. There is an idyllic morning I carry around with me like a lucky rubbing stone. It is 1971, our first summer at the ranch, and Dave and I and our 4 boys have gone fishing on the Big Blackfoot. We drive our sand-colored Land Rover to the edge of a high bank upstream from the mouth of Belmont Creek. Dave and the older boys scramble down to the rocky shore. It is cool in the morning shade of great-branched ponderosas. The salmon fly hatch is about over, but a few of the heavy orange-bodied insects hang onto willow branches in the dewy air. When their wings dry, they will beat suicidally over riffles where lunker rainbows are waiting for breakfast. Use live ones for bait, shouts Dave, knee-deep in green water. Dave moves toward the head of a fishing hole. The boys and I hop through willows, sarvisberry, and chokecherry brush. We snatch the sluggish salmon flies, and within the hour, Dave hooks and nets 2 20-inch rainbows. Eric and Steve, with their squiggling live flies, catch smaller trout. Even I get a good bite. The fishing is hot, and then it's over. I bring out tuna fish sandwiches, peaches and chocolate chip cookies, a thermos of coffee, a jar of lemonade. After lunch, with the sun high and the water cool, I am happy to lie on damp sand. The older guys gone downriver in search of elusive big ones, the 4-year-old twins, making dams out of colored river stones, aquamarine, rose, jade green. Norman MacLean would soon memorialize such Precambrian rocks from the basement of time in the title story of A River Runs Through It. He would describe the Big Blackfoot's deep patterns, the unity of a 3-part fishing hole, the river's billion-year geologic history. MacLean would connect the river and the act of fishing to our Presbyterian brand of theology and to an aesthetic of craft and art. He would articulate the universal feelings of helplessness in the face of destiny and death. But on that faraway summer morning, I had no idea that my humanities professor from the University of Chicago lived just up the road at Seeley Lake. I did not know his wife had recently died or that he had retired from teaching. I would never have guessed that 20 miles upriver, at the age of 73, Norman Maclean was beginning to write a great book about family and fishing and love, or that the book's culminating scene would take place exactly where I sat, daydreaming in the midday Blackfoot breeze. Skip a little part here. So then I skipped 7 years, and in that time, we built our house, my husband died, and my children went off to college, and I bought a volume, the first edition of A River Runs Through It. That just sort of sums it up. 7 years later, in September of 1983, Norman Maclean inscribed my dog-ear copy to Onyx Smith, who lives where it is more beautiful, but so tough the Finns and the Serbs lined their fields with rock piles and then gave up. That's perfect, Norman. And it's true. We had become partners, Norman, Bill Kittredge, and me, in the development of a dramatic film based on that book. The day Maclean signed my book, I had gone to pick him up at his cabin on Seeley Lake. The lake is fed by the Clearwater River, which is a tributary to the Big Blackfoot and part of the same fierce snow country. 500-year-old larch climb from the shore, and each fall the larch shed golden needles on the shingle roof of the log cabin that Norman had helped his father build in 1922. When I arrived, I was shocked to see the 85-year-old author descending a ladder from the roof, broom in hand. "You should take care," I admonished. "I am taking care," Norman snapped back at me. We walked to his dock and gazed across the lake to a peak in the Swan Range wilderness, where a forest fire burned unchecked. Norman worked for the Forest Service in the Bitterroot Mountains as a young man and had come to detest its cut down the trees and make money politics. His last book, Young Men and Fire, was about the Man Gulch Fire of 1948, where 13 young smoke jumpers died senselessly. He was concerned to the end about taking care of what you love. Eventually, Bill wrote a script for A River Runs Through It under Norman's exacting tutelage, and I began the long and painful process of raising production money. But Norman became ill, and Robert Redford became interested in directing and producing the film, and Norman sold him the rights because he believed that in Redford's hands the film would be made soon and made right. The result was a new script by a professional screenwriter, an Academy Award-winning movie and an Academy Award-winning movie that Norman did not live to see. The final irony of A River Runs Through It is that the film was not shot on the Big Blackfoot River. If any story is wedded to place, that one is. But logged-off hillsides make disturbing pictures. The river had become too degraded, said Robert Redford, for his idyllic vision. There are many of us who quarrel with that, and think he had other reasons for not shooting on the Blackfoot. The Big Blackfoot is degraded. Now, I'm going to read some of these things which are now out of date, so I'm going to just fill in with something which is more up to date, because this was written quite a few years ago. The Big Blackfoot is degraded, but it is not as degraded as it was when I wrote this. It's at that time it was number 12 in the nation on the American Rivers Group's listing of threatened watersheds. I don't think it's there anymore. Above Lincoln, the Blackfoot's upper reaches are barren, that's true, still true, poisoned by arsenic and other hard metals leached into the waters from a century of mining for gold, silver, and other precious metals. The area has become one of Montana's beleaguered Superfund sites, with lawsuits and studies and cleanup beginning, but having no end in sight. Still no end in sight. But then there was a huge mine that was proposed to be at the headwaters of the Big Blackfoot River. Phelps Dodge wanted, and a Canadian company wanted to build this heap leach gold mine that would run along the Blackfoot for over a mile. The company wanted to dig a 1,200-foot deep pit 700 feet below groundwater level. They wanted to stack 400 million tons of rock from their pit along Highway 200, adjoining the riverbed. They said they would take care of the environment, but none of us believed them. And then we worked very hard to keep them from doing that, passing legislation that outlawed cyanide heap leach mining in the state of Montana. In a what do you call them? When people do it, a referendum. Yeah. And then the mining companies came back and tried to overturn the referendum, and we beat them again. And they also got beat in court. So it looks like there will not be any more heap leach mining, gold mining, in the state of Montana that uses cyanide, period, forever, unless things change, which they can change. Downstream near Ovando, a fisher person will find trout. Fishing the Big Blackfoot has been tricky for at least 30 years, and it's gotten better lately. I've lived in proximity to it, but now it's stingy and erratic for even the most skilled old-timers. The Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has often stocked the river. In the riffle near our swimming hole, I have caught 8-inch hatchery rainbows with notched fins. Recently, catch and release regulations have been instituted and seem to be successful in helping regeneration in some of the popular reaches along the Blackfoot corridor. But to hook a big native cutthroat trout is still a rare and lucky feat, and you have to let it go. A fisheries expert told me that the Big Blackfoot has the best large river bull trout population in the nation. But that doesn't mean much because bull trout are endangered, and now they're on the endangered species list, which helps to protect the river habitat and the surrounding habitat for all kinds of other species as well. Bull trout are an indicator species. If they go, the western slope cutthroats will soon follow, and the rainbows, the owls, the elk, bear, and cougar. You can go to the Department of State Lands and see satellite photographs of the region. What you will see is a land denuded. Yet the pillage continues, most of the profits going to out-of-state corporations for short-term profits. It seems we never learn. We are determined to repeat the old boom and bust story of the West until nothing is left. Except, as I was telling people this morning, there has been a new development in that same area where Plum Creek, the timber company, is selling its lands to the Nature Conservancy and the Trust for Public Lands. And we hope that this will then create a sustainable forest that will be hospitable to wildlife and humans both. So that's the hope. And part of the work that's been done on the Blackfoot is local, that people have gotten together with a group called the Blackfoot Challenge, which puts together private landowners, state, federal officials, and NGOs, environmental groups. And they have been remarkably successful in putting conservation easements along the river, in repairing riparian habitat and areas. It's a real success story, and it's a model, I think, for rivershed environmental efforts throughout the country. And they put old, crusty ranchers together with Trout Unlimited people, and they all had a common goal, which is they wanted to preserve the land, the economy, the aesthetics, and the wild nature of that whole river valley. And they've been pretty successful. So, then I talk about other depredations and things that are terrible, including just wanton shooting of elk off the highway. And I say, when old ways of living on the land are abandoned, along with ancient rules of hunting and responsibility to natural life, we must invent new ways to appropriate to our new values and technologies. If the river is important, so is the wild country that runs through it, and so are the people who live off the country. Families who have inhabited the Blackfoot Valley for generations are puzzled. You can barely make a living raising cattle anymore or farming when neighbor says the only thing worth a nickel is real estate. That's been true right up to the last year or so. I mean, there's just been for sale sides. Land values have just gone hugely up, and nobody can afford to buy land for agriculture. For over a century, the economy along the Blackfoot has depended on its trees. Logging, millwork, driving log trucks, packaging log homes, making posts and poles. Several of my Sawyer neighbors were employed by the Anaconda Company and Champion until company crews were disbanded. These days they work as Jippo outfits and are paid by the piece. They receive no health benefits, no security, and have little economic motive to care for the land because they know it has been logged beyond sustainability in their lifetimes. There is no place for such men in the new economy of tourism, golf courses, and condos. Last winter, I wandered into Charlie's, a favorite bar on Higgins Avenue in Missoula. The saloon was full of young people garbed in cinchilla and decrying development. Isn't it terrible the way they've widened the Blackfoot Highway so RVs can get over it, said one activist. I'm glad they've improved that road, I said. I drive Highway 200 almost every day and have known too many Valley kids who lost their lives on the dangerous old curves at Rainbow Bend. The activists' Pavlovian response against development was no more exalted than the anti-environmental dogma of wise-use junkies. Polarized attitudes have put people who share basic values at each other's throats. It's crazy. Every year, forest cover for wild animals decreases, erosion increases. Silt chokes creeks and settles in the river. More and more folks log their woodlots and consider subdividing their land because they are out of work and need the income. Every year can witness the transformation of country to suburb, of wildwoods to industrial ugliness. I wonder if we are making a wasteland, if Norman's book and the work of historians, artists, photographers, and journalists will be the only ways our inheritors will come to know the natural diversity and beauty of this land. I know if humans can survive the spiritual blight of a world stripped, I wonder if humans can survive the spiritual blight of a world stripped of wild animals, trees, and pure running water. What kind of creatures will we become? To avoid complicity in destroying what we love, we must learn all over again to adhere to the rules of right conduct. Take the actor William Hurt, who came to Missoula to fish the Big Blackfoot with Norman Maclean. This was in 1983 when Hurt wanted to make a film based on a river runs through it. He is a fine fly fisherman and had been preparing for the ultimate test of his fitness, playing Norman's fisherman brother Paul in the movie. Bill Kittredge and I and Hurt's publicist and partner Lois Smith drove Hurt up the Blackfoot to Sperry Grade and, after a good bit of verbal fencing, finally got him into a rubber raft and floating downriver with Norman and his old fishing crony, George Cronenberg's. Stopping on the highway so Lois could snap some publicity photos, we saw the three men in a raft veer abruptly toward shore. Hurt came racing up the steep bank. Forgot to buy a license, he huffed. No fishing without a license, Norman had ruled, no matter who you are. The run of river Hurt traversed with the two old men is protected by the Nature Conservancy. Other stretches are being conserved through easements or purchased by state, federal, and private environmental groups. Much of the Blackfoot has been designated a wild and scenic rivers area, but rules and